Great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the annual Comparative Religion series. My name is Rabbi Asher Knight, and I am the senior rabbi of Temple Bethel, and I get to be joined by so many colleagues in Charlotte whom I respect and admire greatly. Comparative religion has been a course that has been happening at Temple Bethel for 25 years. And my predecessor, Rabbi Judy Schindler, who we're going to have the opportunity to hear from as well, also continued on in the path of both helping to plan and helping to organize and facilitate and teach. And so I'm so thrilled to have our Rabbi Emeritus here with us. And we'll get more introductions in just a moment. Temple Bethel really strives to be a part of Charlotte and the broader Charlotte region and community. Temple Bethel as a congregation really strives to create a public square where conversation, where dialogue, where our community can gather, and that we can also learn from one another across faith traditions. I am proud of that work. That is not that I started it, or that I have anything much to do with it. I've actually inherited all from Rabbi Judy and the hard work that she did, and her predecessor, Rabbi Bennett, and his predecessor in front of him. This is something that we've inherited, and it's something that's absolutely beautiful. But it's really important for our community. A couple of weeks ago, my good friend Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker was held hostage in Texas, and when I looked at my phone, it turned out that I had so many messages of support from faith leaders across Charlotte. And that's all built out of relationship. And one of the people that we have turned to very often, I have turned to very often as an advisor and as someone who helps to support, particularly through the pandemic, has been Reverend Plaskin, the executive director of Mecklenburg Ministries. So if your faith institution is doing interfaith work, or if your faith institution is doing any sort of work within the city and wants to be immersed within what's going on in our city, I hope that you will check out MECMIN. MECMIN is our city's, our region's premier interfaith organization that creates this type of public square that we're having tonight to help to create it in our community. So on behalf of Temple Bethel, I welcome you. I hope that you find ways to connect with our community or connect with the faith communities that you love, and to MECMIN. And with that, I'm going to introduce Reverend Vladim Plaskin. I'm going to ask you to introduce our phenomenal and awesome speakers.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. We have an amazing lineup tonight of three people who are brilliant scholars and committed interfaith leaders and just lovely people. So I am very excited to introduce the three of them to you. It feels a little funny introducing Rabbi Judy Schindler at a Temple Bethel event. She was the senior rabbi for many years and is now the Rabbi Emerita. She now teaches courses in Jewish studies at Queens on the Holocaust and social justice. And after 21 years in the pulpit, she guides Queens students through thousands of years of religious wisdom to learn from the lowest and highest moments of Jewish history. She also does a fabulous Jewish History of Charlotte tour, which my husband and I have enjoyed very much. She's the founding director of the Stan Greenspan Holocaust and Social Justice Education Center, aiming to inspire advocacy and enable work for justice on the Queens campus and the greater Charlotte community. She's a longtime collaborator with MECMIN, the 2008 recipient of our Community Leader Award, a strong leader in interfaith cooperation and collaboration in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, and beyond. She is the author of a book, Recharging Judaism, How Civic Engagement Helps Synagogues, Jews, and America. She's contributed many articles to books on Judaism and is regularly featured in the Charlotte Observer. Dr. Rodney Sadler is also not new to Temple Bethel. He has taught many times, preached in the sanctuary. His teaching experience includes courses in biblical languages, Old and New Testament interpretation, wisdom literature in the Bible, the history and religion of ancient Israel, and African-American biblical interpretation. His first book was Can a Cushite Change His Skin? An Examination of Race, Ethnicity, and Othering in the Hebrew Bible. and it was published in 2005. He frequently lectures within the church and community on race in the Bible, African-American biblical interpretation, the image of Jesus, biblical archaeology, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and was the managing editor of the African-American Devotional Bible. He served as a visiting lecturer and interim co-director of the Office of Black Church Studies at Duke Divinity School, and was an associate minister in Durham, and is the director of the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation on the Charlotte campus of Union Presbyterian Seminary. He's also a longtime ally of McMinn, served as the president of our board, was the 2013 recipient of our Bridge Builder Award, and the first person I called when it seemed like I might be offered this ED position. So a coffee we had on the morning of my first meeting with our current president was a major factor in my saying yes to this job. So thank you, Rodney, I think, most days. And finally, Dr. Hadia Mubarak joined the Queen's University of Charlotte faculty as an assistant professor of religion in the fall of 2020, after previously serving as an assistant professor of religious studies at Guilford College and a research fellow at New York University, where she wrote her monograph, Rebellious Wives, Neglectful Husbands, Controversies in Modern Quranic Commentaries. Dr. Mubarak completed her PhD in Islamic Studies from Georgetown University, where she specialized in modern and classical Quranic exegesis, Islamic feminism, and gender reform in the modern Muslim world. She currently serves as a scholar in residence with the Muslim Community Center of Charlotte and a scholar with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. She has written extensively and also taught often at Temple Beth El and at McMinn. And we are privileged to have a scholar and a leader of her caliber here in Charlotte, and thrilled to have her with us tonight. I'm so excited to introduce the three of you, and we are so eager to hear from you that I'm going to turn it over to you now. And Rabbi Judy is going to speak first.
Wonderful. I am setting my clock because I want to be sure to leave time for my colleagues so I can listen and learn from them. We were given a huge task, a lot of material to cover in 15 minutes. What an honor it is to serve on this panel with my friends, these scholars, Dr. Mubarak and Dr. Sadler, with whom I'm really humbled to present. We've been asked to share our origin stories of our respective faiths and how these stories contribute to faith, culture, and beliefs of our Charlotte community. There is this author, Robert Seltzer, who wrote this huge tome called Jewish People, Jewish Thought. And he opens this entire more than 700-page book with this statement. He said, 32 centuries ago, the Jewish people brought its root principle, a singular, imageless, invisible, commanding God, across the border from Near Eastern semi-desert pasture land to the urban agrarian civilization of Canaan. A tradition is like a personality, a complex unity, a flow of elements received from previous generations, assimilated and passed on, adapted to and combined with elements of other cultures, repeated, filtered, censored, refashioned, subjected to the shifts of emphasis, preserved for long stretches in a state of apparent changelessness, yet periodically reformed according to new perspective, always retaining a core of sameness on which it depends for potency, sustenance, and vigor. That is Judaism. It is evolving, changing, developing, and transforming. Now, when a child is born, that child is given a name. So I will look at 4 births and 4 consequent names of the Jewish people: Hebrew, Israelite, Jew, and Reformed Jew. And for each gestational period and subsequent birth, they each crafted us into who we are today as Jews. And that is what we bring to our city of Charlotte. As evidenced here by this 25-year history of a comparative religion program, where I stand with 2 others of faith, not just to study tonight, but we write together, we work together, we heal one another. So let us start with birth story number 1. Abraham, the Hebrew, and the birth of our family of faith. In our first birth story, Avram or Abraham is called Ivri, and we as Jews are called Ivrim, Hebrews. And that name comes from the root of the word avar, which means to cross over. For Abraham hears the call of God, and on one level, he crosses over the Euphrates River to start his life in the land of Canaan, now Israel. But on a deeper level, he crossed over from a world of polytheism to acknowledge one supreme God. Abraham stood on one side ideologically, while the whole world stood on the other. In Genesis 12, Abraham was called to take a journey. God called to him and said, Lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladetcha u'mibeit avicha ela artz asher areka. Go forth from your native land, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you. And all the families of the earth shall bless themselves through you. Now, the Torah doesn't tell us that Abraham was a monotheist, but instead, Abraham acknowledges the primacy of God whom he heard and followed. It was the ancient interpreters who put that monotheistic lens on the Torah and tell us the midrash of the idols, that Abraham grew up in a home of Terach, who was an idol maker, and saw that these idols were ineffective and smashed them one day, blaming it on the largest idol. And Terach said, Abraham, how could you do that? And Abraham said, I didn't do it. It was the idol. And Terach said, but that idol has no power to do that. Whereupon Abraham responded, you deny their power, yet you worship them. In the biblical text, Abram or Avram would become Abraham, and Sarai would become Sarah. And Abraham would learn his covenantal responsibilities. In exchange for a covenant with God and greatly increased progeny, Avram would circumcise himself, his family, and his households, and the subsequent generations would do the same on the 8th day. Now, this origin story of our family of faith is noteworthy in the following ways. Avram's call is immediately connected to the land. The whole land of Canaan, God promised, I will give to you as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you. But Avram's destiny is not solely connected with the land. Upon his arrival, he immediately faces famine and is forced to leave for a brief time. Avram was called to personal responsibility. He would divide the land with his nephew Lot, for there was quarreling between the two of them. And Avram was called to moral responsibility. He would argue on behalf of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. God said to Avram, God asked rhetorically, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Because God wanted to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And God said, should I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do, since he's about to become a great and populous nation, and all the nations of the earth are to bless themselves by him? For I have singled him out, that he may instruct his children and progeny to keep the ways of God by doing what is just and right. La'asot tzedakah u'mishpat, in order that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he promised them. The promise of God, the covenant of God, had responsibilities for Abraham and has responsibilities for us to do what is right, to ensure that justice prevails, for God cannot do it alone. According to Mishnah Avot, Abraham was tested with 10 tests and withstood them all, including the final test where he was called to sacrifice his son, and a distinction was made from the world in which Abraham came, and children were sacrificed to Molech, to the world in which Abraham created, where child sacrifice would cease. Now, one critical moment, one thing to consider in this birth story is that there was a gestational period prior. Prior to the birth of Judaism were the 11 chapters of Genesis, highlighting the humanity and universality on which our faith was formed. In Genesis 1, God called out and said, let us make humanity in our image after our likeness. And God created humanity in God's own image. In the divine image, God created them, male and female. God created them. In the womb, we learned that there was an equality to all humanity. So our birth story number one is built on universalism, a concern for all that moves to particularism, a focus on our family of faith that calls us back to engage with the universal world in which we live. In the womb, we learned that there was equality to all humanity, and that is the commitment we bring to Charlotte. We celebrate as Jews our uniqueness, our particularism, and share it proudly with the community, adding to the diversity that makes Charlotte so beautiful. And we uphold our responsibility to others to pursue what is just and right as lawyers, as civic leaders, as volunteers, as at Room in the Inn, among so many other roles. We are tied to the land. Israel has been central to our liturgy and lives since the inception of our faith, and we learn to live outside our land. Both the land and diaspora are central to our being. And then as a family of faith, we move down to Egypt at the end of Genesis, and we have birth story number two, the birth of our people, Israel. The name Israel comes from Jacob, Abraham's grandson. He was called Yaakov, one who supplants, but he overcomes the bad parts of his personality, the places in which he needs to grow, and he becomes Yisrael, one who struggles with God. So in this second story, we are birthed as a nation of Israel at Sinai. We are given that name, Israel. The gestational stage for the second birth story occurred in Egypt, and the birth canal was our passing through the sea of reeds to freedom on dry ground. That Exodus, our story of the journey from slavery to liberation, is a Jewish foundational narrative. Our longing for freedom and redemption has given Jewish people our drive throughout its history to remain Jewish despite the hardships that came our way, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the Holocaust. When we stood at Sinai, we made this promise. On the third new moon after leaving Egypt, we stood there and we camped at the foot of the mountain, and Moses went up the mountain, and God called out and said, "If you obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the people. Indeed, all the earth is mine, but you shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation." And so we said to God, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will do what is in this Torah, and we will understand. And tradition teaches that we made a covenant, a commitment not only to God, but as we stood at the mountain as 600,000 people, we made promises to one another, 600,000 promises. So how does that play out in Charlotte? Our birth as a Jewish people at Sinai 3,300 years ago ties us together today. We see that commitment to peoplehood in Shalom Park, at the Jewish Community Center, even at the Hebrew Cemetery. We see that commitment through the long list of donations to Jewish agencies that members of our Jewish community make. Our foundational story of going from slavery to liberation drives us to work to redeem those who are oppressed, the stranger. We work to bring about equity and safety for all immigrants, those with all shades of skin, our LGBTQA members, the impoverished. In so many cases, we are them and they are us. Now, after journeying for 40 years through the wilderness, and finally settling in the land of Israel, we built our temple in Jerusalem and we thrived. Yet after King Solomon's death, the kingdom became divided. There were 10 tribes in the north and 2 tribes in the south. And in 722, the Assyrians cast off and carried away in exile the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They'd become lost. But the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin, remained. The northern kingdom was Israel and the southern kingdom was Judah. Twice in 586 BCE and in 70 CE, The temple was destroyed and Judah was destroyed. The Judeans were carried off into exile, which brings us to birth story number 3, the birth of the Jew, longing for the land, but living as a people in exile. Now, that current name of Jew was first identified with the inhabitants of the southern 2 tribes. We were Judeans who became known as Jews. We fought for and clung to the land with all our heart, souls, and might. And with the destruction of the temple and exile, we rebirthed ourselves again. The Torah would become our portable temple. In it and from it, we would find meaning and mission, with Shabbat and holidays as our sacred time and 613 commandments as our path for living our lives. We would build commentary to craft the Torah to each generation, whether we lived in Babylon or Rome or Egypt or Eastern Europe and Arab lands and even in America, which brings us to birth story number 4, the birth of the modern Jew, the Reformed Jew. So we fast forward 1700 years or so. Reformed Judaism was born out of Enlightenment and the French Revolution. As ghetto walls were torn down and Jews became citizens of the countries where they resided, and they could settle where they desired, dress as they wanted, study in public schools and universities, and engage in occupations of their choosing. They mixed with the broader population and sometimes intermarried, and started to recognize that rather than being forced to choose between Judaism and modernity, they could craft their faith in light of modernity. They had choices. So from our birth in Germany in the early 1800s, we cast away or reformed traditional practices. We created liturgy and sermons in our languages and songs filled with choirs and instruments. And we brought that Reformed philosophy, ideology, that choice and practice to America, this fertile soil of religious freedom. The essence of Reformed Judaism is choice and autonomy to make decisions about Jewish life based on knowledge and commitment to being Jewish. So how does it all play out in Charlotte? With the birth of Reformed Judaism, we could live in 2 worlds, in universities and in Jewish houses of study. So how does it affect us? We can build friendships and collegial relationships across faith lines as we do right now, as I do, and blessed to do with Dr. Mubarak and Dr. Sadler and Reverend Plaskin. I believe I know them as well as I know so many of you in our congregation. And we can be civic leaders. Like Abraham, we are Ivrim, Hebrews, unafraid to stand for our unique faith, a minority of 14 million in a world of 7.9 billion. In a city of 5 Jewish congregations, in a sea of 960 churches, and under 16 mosques. And like the Israelites at Sinai, we bring our commitment to Jewish peoplehood and our commitment to Charlotteans to life. Like Jews who clung to Israel, even as they built in other places, we build where we are while working to build up our homeland into the best it can be for our brothers and sisters and all who are there. And like Reformed Jews of Germany, we embrace science and learning and are committed to engaging fully with our neighbors and friends. When Jeremiah saw that we'd be a people dispersed, he wisely advised us, seek the shalom, the peace and prosperity of the city to which I carried you into exile. Pray to God for its peace, because in its peace, you too will find peace. Thank you.
I suppose I should just jump in here.
Well, let me just say one thing quickly, Rodney. We forgot to mention that people can go ahead and put questions in the chat. So if you have questions for a specific speaker or questions that kind of cross the different pieces, we won't be able to get to all of them, but put whatever you have in the chat and we'll keep track of them and get back to them at the end. So sorry. Welcome, Rodney.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here tonight. Thank you so much, Rabbi Knight, for the invitation to be here, Reverend Vladim, for this opportunity to be able to speak, Temple Bethel, for allowing me to come back and speak to you again. I have to say that as I listened to Rabbi Schindler just speak there, I have a feeling she misses being in a pulpit because she just preached. She didn't just tell you a story, she preached. So tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about the origins of Christianity. And as I start to think about this, I realize that I'm somewhat perplexed about how to do this, distinct from thinking about Christianity and thinking about Islam. In essence, they all have the same origin story. They all begin with God's creation of the world and an assertion of the supremacy of one God over all creation. They all focus on the centrality of Ibrahim as the faithful servant who does all that God said and births each of our traditions, worshiping the same God. They all focus on many of the same leaders like Adam and Ibrahim, Moses, Musa, and so many of the prophets who are crucial to all of our understanding of morality and our devotion to that same God. Perhaps most significantly for me, they all start not as faiths as much as they start as movements for liberation of oppressed humanity and a theologically driven narrative promising a better world. This is true of Moses, whom God uses to free enslaved Hebrews from Egypt, Jesus, whom God uses to challenge oppressive Roman imperial hegemony in Palestine, and Muhammad, who frees his people from oppressive systems, illiteracy, and idolatry. That is perhaps how I want to frame the origin stories of Christianity today. It begins in a time period when the Judean people have been for centuries dominated and oppressed by foreign forces. The Assyrians who exiled Israel, the Babylonians who exiled Judah, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans who then followed and threatened to destroy Jerusalem yet again if the people did not submit to their authority. Perhaps things became even more troubling when the Romans installed a foreign king on the throne of Jerusalem. Herod the Idumean, read descendant of the Edomites, a child of Esau, not Jacob. And then when he died, they divided the land into 4 smaller fiefdoms. The Judean people had become increasingly frustrated living under foreign occupation. Many of them longed for a better world, a better day, a day of the dominance of their people, like in the days of King David. They were awaiting a Mashiach. In this period, there were numerous potential messianic figures and movements that sought Jewish independence, like the Essenes that lived around the Dead Sea, the Sicarii who were rebels against the Romans in the midst of the cities, even John the Baptizer, who established a system of Jewish purification to prepare the people for the coming of God. It was into this context that Jesus was born. He was born the son of a carpenter tradesman in the town of Bethlehem. He was called a son of God, a title used for Jewish kingship because he was associated with the Davidic line. He began his public life as part of John's baptismal renewal movement, and upon John's arrest and murder by Herod the Tetrarch, King Herod's son, Jesus began a related movement. Jesus's movement was predicated on the arrival of the kingdom or the reign of God in this world. In this kingdom, the poor would hear the good news, the sick would be cured, the blind would see, the lame would walk, the hungry would be fed, the unclean would be purified, the naked would be clothed, the aliens welcomed, the incarcerated freed, and the oppressed liberated. The kingdom of God was juxtaposed to the Roman Empire as the Lord was declared to be the only legitimate ruler, and Caesar would be eventually displaced. And all the world would come eventually to worship Israel's God once and for all, recognizing that only the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was worthy of allegiance and obedience. Jesus began his movement in the small villages and towns of Hagalil in the Galilee, and as he marched from town to town, sending organizers 2 by 2 before him, he gathered a group of followers. These followers he trained in a system of love-based nonviolent resistance that was predicated on forming a new egalitarian community. After 3 years of the movement, he marched his followers to Jerusalem. He was coronated king on the Mount of Olives, and he marched into Jerusalem and cleansed the temple, thought to have been corrupted by an abusive system. Jesus was captured by the leaders of his nation, condemned to die for sedition by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, and crucified like so many other rebellious Jews on a cross just outside of Jerusalem's gates. Buried in a tomb in a nearby garden. He remained in the grave for 2 nights and 3 days. On the 3rd day, he was resurrected and rose again from the dead. His resurrection for the Christian church is a testimony that God can and God will do anything and everything that believers need. Jesus' movement was one for justice and liberation, initially inaugurated with words from the prophet Isaiah. Luke chapter 4, verse 18 says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free." Jesus' ministry was predicated on bringing justice to an unjust world that in his day was replete with the yoke of Roman imperial suppression. So in his inaugural word, his trial sermon, so to speak, Jesus announces a theological call for poverty abatement, for prison reform, and for healing the infirm and the ending of oppression. His message was focused on the advent of the reign of God in this world, a period when the God of the Hebrew peoples would be the one true ruler over all the world. Matthew chapter 6, verse 10, it says, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." In essence, Jesus said that God's intervention in this world was a present concern. God's kingdom was not something to be awaited in an otherworldly future time. God's reign was evidenced by God's will being done here on earth in the same way that it's manifest in heaven. Jesus was talking about this worldly change. In the aftermath of his resurrection, people started to live differently because of the Spirit of God falling democratically on all of humanity, a manifestation of a prophecy predicted by the prophet Joel. People began to live differently. The book of Acts chapter 2, verses 43 and 44 through 45, it says, "All came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as they had need." Because of their new life as followers of Jesus, reflections of a more just society were evidenced among believers, and they began to enact justice within their community. They, like their Essene counterparts at Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea, began a communalist lifestyle. In essence, a bunch of kibbutzim, it seems, forgiving debts, eradicating need, and sharing in their own abundance. In the aftermath of Jesus' resurrection and ascension, a disciple of the Sanhedrin member Rabbi Gamaliel named Saul began to persecute what he thought was an errant sect of Judaism. After a traumatic conversion encounter on the road to Damascus, he began to preach Jesus and challenge the former beliefs of heresy of the Christian way that he had held. In fact, he came to a different understanding, not only of who the Christians were, but many juxtaposed relationships, even that of Jews and Gentiles. In Galatians chapter 3, verses 27 through 29, he says, "As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise." Saul, now called Paul, began to proclaim not only that Gentiles were able to directly access God without conversion, but that they had become children of Abraham as well. I will end this summation of much of Jesus' instructions with a statement that sort of undergirds the ethos of the nascent Christian church. It was born of instruction in the books of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 5. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and of Leviticus chapter 19, 18b, and love your neighbor as yourself. And it was enhanced by the sayings of Jesus. So I'll end with these words from 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 8 and 19 through 21. "Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. We love because he first loved us. Those who say, I love God and hate their brothers and sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from him is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also. This became the fundamental guiding principle for the new Christian community and continues to be at the center of faith claims for this movement today. Love is at the heart of the Jesuit ethic and was the feature that continues to govern the proper functioning of the church in the world today. It is this concept that inspires work for justice and keeps the liberation movement Jesus started 2,000 years ago alive to this very day. Thank you all so very much for listening.
Speaking of sermons. All right. Hadia, we are eager to hear from you.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. And I am going to also share a slide, PowerPoint here. So let's see if we can get it. So good evening. It's really an honor to participate at Temple Bethel's series on comparative religion, which is a testament to the pluralistic vision of the synagogue. In the 21st century, I'm turning on my timer really quickly. In the 21st century, our global community is still very much in need of such rich, pluralistic encounters in which we allow ourselves to let down our guards and learn about a religious tradition other than our own. I personally learned a lot from Rabbi Judy, who's spoken to my classes a number of times, and I'm always fascinated by the deep intersections between the Midrash and Muslim exegesis, Quranic exegesis. And I've also learned a lot from my colleague and friend, Dr. Sadler. So in terms of Islam in specific, we're exploring a religious tradition that represents nearly a fourth of the world's inhabitants today. And in this time period in which we live, your presence here today to understand the origins of the three Abrahamic faiths and the diversity of their respective practitioners speaks volumes about your intellectual curiosity and your open-mindedness. And in this age of hyper-nationalism, we often get lost in our differences, that we lose sight of the essence of our common humanity. In the Muslim tradition, we believe the essence of our humanity is the soul, which is intangible and transcendent. It therefore rises above the particularities of our different races, genders, religious identities, and nationalities. So before I begin to talk about the origins of Islam, I first want to problematize our use of this word, Islam. So what do we really mean when we say Islam? Do we mean the textual sources of Islam, the scripture and the prophetic tradition? Or when we use the word Islam, are we really thinking about Islam's interpretive tradition, the way scholars have historically derived theology, law, and ethics from the primary textual sources? Or when we say Islam, do we really mean the normative practices of living Muslim communities? And if we are going to evaluate Islam based on the ways that Muslims actually practice the faith, well, which historical period do we look at? Which geographic locations do we look at Muslims in 7th century Arabia? Do we think about the way Muslims practiced Islam in 12th century Spain, or the way Muslims currently live Islam in the 21st century? And of course, even then, which countries do we look at? Do we look at Muslim minorities in the West? So I think it's really important when we use this word that we distinguish between these three broad categories: Islam's textual sources, the interpretive tradition, and lived Islam. So as for Islam's textual sources, there are two authoritative sources for Muslims. The primary source is the Quran, which Muslims believe is a direct word of God transmitted through Angel Gabriel to Prophet Muhammad. And the second important textual source, which is of course secondary to the Quran, is the Hadith. And I will point out that the canon of Hadith is different for Shia and Sunni Muslims. Some of it overlaps, but there are distinct collections for Shia and Sunni Muslims. The Quran, on the other hand, is the same for Sunni, Shia, Ismailis, and other sects. The interpretive tradition includes theology, law, Quranic exegesis, ethics, and Islamic spirituality, among other disciplines. And one of the most distinct features of Islam's interpretive tradition is its pluralism. So on any given issue, it's common to find a multiplicity of interpretation, and historically different schools and trends emerged in various disciplines, really due to different methods of interpretation. I want to tackle this boogie monster of a word, Sharia. So Sharia is a term that is often misunderstood. It's an abstract notion that means divine law, or this idea of how does God want you to live your life? Linguistically, it means a path to water. Yet, how can human beings definitively determine divine intent? So the actual corpus of legal rulings is known as fiqh, and F-I-Q-H. And there is a understanding that this represents a human attempt by scholars to faithfully derive law from Islam's textual sources based on various methods such as legal reasoning, philology, historical context, etc. But fiqh is the product of a human interpretation, whereas Sharia is this really abstract notion of living your life the way God wants you to. So when Muslims across the world hear that various states in the United States want to ban Sharia, they're very confused, to say the least, because again, Sharia is this very broad notion that's very abstract. And for the third category of lived Islam, we need to distinguish between two words, Islam and Muslims, which are often conflated. Islam, of course, is a religious tradition that spans 15 centuries, while Muslims are human beings that either consciously choose to adhere to Islam or are socialized within a predominantly Muslim culture. But what Muslims believe and what they practice is not necessarily aligned with the teachings of Islam as a religious tradition. And in fact, Muslims differ among themselves on very fundamental questions, such as what are the criteria for salvation? What rights do women have in Islam? And if I had more time, I could, show you the very diverse experiences when it comes to women in Islam based on where they live in the world. So this is a reminder, there is no singular Muslim experience or interpretation of Islam, and the experiences of Muslims greatly vary from one country to another based on a variety of factors. So as our, and I need to just ask, do I need to let people in, or is there someone managing them? Okay, so as our topic today is on the origins of our faith traditions, I would like us to go back to the very beginning, to the story of human creation. So Muslims believe that God's act of creation is encapsulated in the command be, which translates into Arabic as kun, which actually consists of two letters, kaf and noon, the K and the noon, and the N. So the Quran repeatedly states that if God decrees something to happen, he simply says to it, be, and it is, and he is beyond causation. So for example, we have these verses, all it takes when he wills something to be is simply to say to it, be, and it is. And some Muslim philosophers believe that God's act of creating the entire universe and everything within it was contained between these two letters, the kaf and the noon, which represents the K and N. According to Muslim theology, God is the beginning and the end. There is nothing that predates God, who creates humans from non-existence. The Muslim conception of the origins of humanity overlap in some important ways with the Hebrew Bible. In the Quranic narrative, God first creates, then he forms or fashions the human into perfection, and then breathes into the human his spirit. One important point is there are only two characters in the Quran or figures described in this way, and those were Adam and Jesus, both of whom are born in non-biological ways or conventional biological ways. So I thought, and of course, this is to some extent similar to Genesis 2, where God breathes into the nostrils of Adam. However, one of the distinct features of the origin story in the Quran is God's announcement to the angels when he first creates Adam, or when he decides to create Adam. And he says, and this is a verse, it's 2:30, he says, and recall when your Lord told the angels, I am putting a successor on earth. And I'll go into the response of the angels in a minute, but the important word here is this idea of humans being representatives of God on earth, which in some ways is different than Genesis 1, where humans are created in the image of God, but it's also similar in some respect, because humans have a very specific role to play. They're not just another one of God's creation. They have to cultivate the earth and manifest God's divine attributes in this world. But what we also find is that the angels first protest this act of the human creation. And they state, according to the Quran, will you place in it someone who will spread corruption there and shed blood while we glorify your praises and proclaim your holiness? And God responds and says, I know what you do not know. And then the next verses, well, before I get to the next verses, I want to point out that Muslim exegetes were wondering what reference point did the angels have to assume that the human being was going to wreak this havoc, which, honestly, they weren't wrong considering the first, biological brothers. There's already the first human homicide between Cain and Abel. And of course, that story is also in the Quran. And so some Muslim exegetes said perhaps there was another creation before the human creation that did wreak havoc and did cause bloodshed. Some say perhaps it was another creation called the jinn, but I just wanted to point that out, that this is sort of this point of debate. Now, the next two verses show us that God illustrates to the angels why he's created this human being. And so verse 231 tells us God first teaches Adam the names of all things, and then he presents these things to the angels, and he tells them, tell me the names of these if what you say is true. And they are unable to. And they say, we have no knowledge except what you have taught us. And then he brings Adam along and he says, Adam, tell them the names of these. And when he told them their names, God said, did I not tell you that I know what is hidden in the heavens and the earth, and that I know what you reveal and what you conceal? So, of course, there's a lot to interpret here. Like, why is the story of Adam knowing the names and being able to repeat the names? Why is this an illustration of why God has created the human being? Well, what we find is that the human being has this unique ability to reason and speak, which distinguishes the human from the rest of creation. And what we all know, the events that transpire after this in the Garden of Eden, and these events underscore the fact that humans have free will, that they have agency, and they have the ability to make moral choices. So what happens after their infamous exit from the gardens? According to the Quran, both Adam and Eve ask for forgiveness. So, well, I'm going to skip the slide here, but of course we know in Genesis 2, Adam also gets to name things, right? He's not necessarily being conveyed the names, but he does get to name. He has this power of naming things. So according to the Quran, both Adam and Eve asked for forgiveness. So we have this verse 723, they replied, our Lord, we have wronged ourselves. And if you do not forgive us and have mercy on us, we will certainly be losers. And in 237, it says, then Adam was inspired with words of prayer by his Lord. So he accepted his repentance. Surely he is the acceptor of repentance. The theological implications of this is there's no concept of original sin in Islamic theology, because Adam and Eve were forgiven. So we believe humans are born in the state of purity and without sin. And of course, this then influences the way Muslims view the role of Jesus on earth. I'm going to try to wrap up. I realize I have about 3 minutes. I want to say that the concept of revelation is essential to Muslim belief. So back to the story of Adam being forgiven, according to some Muslim exegetes, this is the point at which he becomes a prophet. And this concept of chosen prophethood is essential to Muslim theology. Just as God creates human beings and makes them morally accountable for the way they live their lives, he also sends them messengers and books of guidance throughout human history. And this is a recurring theme according to the Quran. So this concept of revelation is important, and Muslims do not believe that the Quran is the first scripture revealed to humanity, but the last. And just as Prophet Muhammad symbolizes to Muslims the seal of prophethood, meaning the last one, so too does the Quran symbolize the seal of divine scriptures. The belief in all of God's revelations to humanity is one of Islam's 6 pillars of faith. There are 5 scriptures identified in the Quran, although Quranic commentators believe there were more than just 5, but these are the 5 that are identified. They are the Suhuf, the scrolls revealed to Abraham, the Torah, of course, revealed to Moses, the Psalms to David, the Gospels revealed to Jesus, and the Quran revealed to Muhammad. Now, what's interesting is the New Testament is not necessarily that revelation encapsulates the teachings of Jesus and the teachings, according to first account witnesses that were passed on to people who of course, we know the writers of the Gospels did not see Jesus. So the question is, if Muslims believe there was this revelation sent to Jesus, where is it today? Well, Muslims will say, we don't know where it is. Perhaps some of it was encapsulated in the New Testament, but we believe it is there. So the Quran continuously affirms that Prophet Muhammad is not introducing a new theology, but is confirming the same theological message as previous messengers. This is a good example. This verse right here, showing that the prophet is being asked to confirm what came before him, the Torah and the gospel. And another verse, again, mentioning that the prophet is just a continuation of biblical prophets. So Muslims view the biblical prophets of the Hebrew Bible and New Testament not primarily as biological ancestors, but as spiritual ancestors. And I'll end with this. And so, this word Muslim, really means one who submits to God. So Muslims will say, okay, Abraham predates Islam. He predates Christianity and Judaism in some ways. So the Quran refers to him as a Muslim. Why would the Quran refer to him as a Muslim? Well, Arabic predates Islam as well. And so in that language, really a Muslim is simply one who submits to God. So Muslims would say all of these prophets are brothers, one of another, with the same essential theology of worshiping one God and being accountable and prepared for that ultimate meeting with God. So sorry if I went over time. Thank you so much.
Well, we're not sorry at all. Thank you. I want to thank Rabbi Schindler, Dr. Sadler, Dr. Mubarak for an unbelievably beautiful set of presentations, a lot of what we can build off of and ask about. A reminder that you can put questions in the chat box. Our awesome Comparative Religion Committee is looking at the chat box and is typing up questions and sort of helping us sift through it. I do have some questions to start with and want to be able to just go ahead and start with having a conversation, if that's okay. So Dr. Mubarak, you spoke beautifully about the diversity within the Muslim world. And I really appreciate that. And I was wondering, Rabbi Schindler and Dr. Sadler, if you could also highlight about some of the diversity within the Jewish and the Christian world, because I know that it is, in Hebrew, we have a phrase that says, yesh yoter miderech echad l'hiyot yehudit, there is more than one path to be towards Judaism. And I'm just sort of wondering if you can help elevate for us what the diversity within both within Judaism and with Christianity, and also Dr. Mubarak, if you want to expand upon that at all about Islam as well. Rabbi Schindler?
Okay, well, I feel like there are a lot of Jews here and they know a lot about the diversity, but for everyone, we are a smaller community. So our diversity is not as extensive as the Christian community and the many denominations. We have fewer denominations, but I think, largely they can be broken down to a place where we look at divine revelation. So we have the Orthodox who believe that God literally revealed the Torah and follow it in a strict sense. There are ultra-Orthodox and there are modern Orthodox. And we have Reform who see Torah as perhaps humanly authored or divinely inspired and believe in autonomy. We have Conservative whose change happens in a more progressive way. We have Humanists who who see God more in the humanity of our faith and sort of remove God from their worship. And we have many secular Jews. To be Jewish means to be part of the Jewish people. So I just, I've probably 2 people this week I've counseled who have children who they really haven't raised in a traditional sense to learn about Judaism and to study Judaism, but they feel a deep sense of being part of the Jewish people. So Jewish identity is varied, and even to be a part of one denomination, you'll see many expressions within that denomination.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sadler. Thank you for this. I'd like to take this in 2 different directions. So if you think about the Christian church, it starts off very early on with what we think about as the Eastern Church or the Orthodox Church. This church actually begins to divide between what we think about as East and West, when you have the Orthodox Church in the East In the West, we have what we call the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church sort of became the dominant figure in the Western portion of Europe, and then goes on to spin off other denominations and sects. The most significant of this is the Protestant Reformation, which spun off the Protestants. And most of the denominations that we recognize in the United States as the largest and most significant tend to come from the Protestant sects. So your of course, Ladaine will list up Baptists, but your Methodists, your Presbyterians, your Pentecostals, and all of these various groups are part of these different traditions. Now, all of these divisions tend to be around matters of dogma and doctrine. There's something that they're on about, and that decide we can't hang out with you because we believe this. So I'll give you an example from my own tradition. As Baptists, we believe that only people who have confessed their faith in Jesus Christ should be allowed to be baptized and should be able to be part of the faith. Other groups, Pentecostals, believe that in order to prove that you are actually Christian, you have to have an experience doing something like speaking in tongues and having that sort of spiritual experience. So there are a number of different groups and sects, and quite so many different groups that we think about as sort of ancillary to the Christian church, or actually Christian in origin, like the Quakers or Society of Friends, like the Unitarian Universalists start off as non-Trinitarian Christians. Even groups like the Jesus Christ and the Latter-day Saints, the Mormon community, actually has roots in the Christian faith. So this is one thing I'd say, is that there, one of my former deans said that that churches multiply by division. And that's sort of what we see happening over and over again in the Christian community. We divide, and then we make more of whatever we've divided. The second way I'll answer this question is that there's always at the heart of Christianity a fundamental notion that we believe in a diversity of things, a diversity of opinion. As an illustration of this, there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. None of them agree 100% about the larger story. They all have they've got different details, different ways of telling the same story, different orders, et cetera, et cetera. And what this says to me is that early on, the community that came together, the Jesus movement came together, and they said, we don't all have to believe the exact same thing the exact same way. We can hold that there are different ways of viewing the gospel of Jesus Christ and what that means to all of us. So I think that will be my second answer, that we have both these dogmatic splits and then this internal decision early on to allow for a diversity of views to be deemed part of what was considered the official, I don't want to use orthodox because I've used a different term, but the official version of what the church is.
Thank you. Dr. Mubarak, did you want to add anything about that, or about, you spoke beautifully, but I just want to give you the chance to ask.
In the contemporary period, I would say that the main difference would be in regards to how do we engage with the sources of Islam? How do we engage with these sexual sources? And so you have a more literalist approach, which would be a Salafi, kind of Salafi, not everyone is literal Salafi, but that's one important term to bear in mind. And then you have others that believe you don't just go straight to the sources, they need to be mediated through all these other disciplines and going through the classical tradition. And that is sort of actually the classical tradition, going through the classical tradition has been the mainstream way for the last 1400 years, except for the rise of Salafism today. And I think the main difference is that this classical tradition is diverse and it's pluralistic, whereas the Salafi method is a lot more like there is one way. And I think there is a question here where somebody kind of asked, there's just a little bit more, let's say less tolerant than, whereas the classical tradition would say, okay, there's 4 schools, they're all valid. One marriage contract might be valid in this school, not the other, so that's the main thing. It's the relationship to the sources.
Thank you. So everyone has identified monotheism, and there's a question that emerged, which is, yes, monotheism, but is it the same God? right? Is the God of Christianity the same as Adonai, as the God of Judaism, as the same as Allah, right? Like, is it the same? Is it the same God? What is the same, or what is different?
If I can go first with this one, so I think this is one of the major misconceptions when it comes to Islam, and it's both partially because of Muslims who insist on using the word Allah instead of saying God in English, and partly because of, on the other extreme, people who also believe Muslims worship a distinct God than Christians and Jews. But the word Allah, if I can type it in the chat. So the word ilah is basically God with a lowercase g in Arabic, and ilah could be like an idol, it could be your whims and desires, anything that can be worshipped that's not really God. So Allah really came from al-ilah, meaning the God. So al-ilah basically became Allah, meaning the God, the one and only God, the creator of the heavens and earth. And Allah is basically the merger of al-ilah, the God, capital G. And really, for Muslims, Allah is the God of the Hebrew Bible and New Testament. And I think there's a lot of confusion because of Muslims who insist on using the Arabic for whatever reason and not translating it.
Thank you. Dr. Sadler or Rabbi Schindler?
Yeah. Rabbi Schindler?
Really, I think it's more in can you hear me? I think it's in Dr. Sadler's hands more than mine. I clearly, we all worship God, but in Christianity, in some people's understanding of Christianity is the Trinity. So that's where it gets more confusing for us. So, Allah and Elohim and Adonai, and we have many, many names for God in Judaism, and we understand God in many ways. But I think the greater challenge is to understand how Christianity, reflects that God to whom Jews and Muslims pray. So I'm going to pass it back to Rodney.
Thank you. I appreciate that pass back. I like to walk in the woods, and I find a great deal of relief from my time in the woods, and I hear God talking to me often. I was walking in the woods one day, and I saw a tree that was growing, and I looked at the bottom of the tree, and I saw this common root. And then as it grew further up, I saw that it split off into what looked like 3 distinct trees, but they're all from the same common root. And I began to think, perhaps this is the best metaphor for describing what the Trinity is. It's not saying that there are 3 different gods. It never was intended to say that. It's just saying that the same God has 3 different expressions that are manifest. When I think about the nature of the way that this works in the Christian church, I often think that the problem is that we have deified a metaphor and lost sight of the God that it describes. And what I mean by this is the Trinity is at best a metaphor. It's in a way of trying to say, how do we hold together these different aspects or expressions of the way that we imagine God to be? And if God manifests God's self in one way as Spirit, in another way as Father, another way as Son, how can we think about them as different or the same God? And in essence, it's just a metaphor. I think it would be healthier for us to say that's one metaphor out of many other. We might say God as shepherd. We might say God as eagle or chicken with brood under her wings. We might see that God has many metaphors. The problem, I think, though, this is not just the Jews say this about Christianity or the Muslims say this about Christianity. I think it's that Christians have put so much stock in this notion of Trinity that we've lost sight of the fact that it was never meant to define the numinous, undefinable God. It was just meant to give human beings something to hang a hat on so that they could figure out, how do we understand the complexities of this God who's far too vast? And truth be told, yeah, we all worship the same God. There is only one God. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. There's only one God. And throughout all of this, we far too often quibble over metaphors. I think if we moved beyond that, we begin to say that that same God in Judaism, in Islam, and Christianity keeps saying the same thing. You all need to love each other. You all need to treat each other well. You all need to treat each other with respect. If we could begin to focus more on that and less on our argument over which metaphor is the best metaphor to describe the undefinable God, I think we'd be much better off.
Thank
I
you.
love that. I love that, Dr. Sadler. I've never heard that the Trinity is a metaphor. And because it's always been another, I asked Reverend Plaskin, Vladim came to my class last week, and I asked her about the Trinity, and she sort of froze and said, oh, I should have studied for that, which made me realize that it's not something that every Christian has, on hand and believes so steadfastly. But if we can look at it as a metaphor, we have so many names in Judaism for God. And I think that can break down some of the walls between us, though I think our differences are really important and they're beautiful. And we don't need to be, singing Kumbaya as we enter into dialogue. We can look at the hard differences between us that have created strife over the millennia.
So, thank you. This is just perhaps a similar question, but maybe take a different tack at it. Like thinking about these origin stories, how would you say that each of your faiths talk about people of other faiths? Do you think of do you teach that your way is the only way to God? And how does that interplay with the origin stories?
I'll take a shot at this, if you all don't mind. I think most faiths teach that their faith is the only way to get to heaven, the only way to access it. I think as a Christian, one of the things I've come to realize is that the choice of who gets into heaven, who makes it in, has little to do with me and only to do with God. So I try not to comment too much on things that are way above my pay grade. But what I do say is, and particularly living in interfaith space, having worked with Mech men for better part of more than a decade, I guess, one of the things I found is that there is that of light and that of God in all of these different faith traditions. And if we listen, we can hear and we can learn about what God is saying through all of these traditions. I can not say that Judaism is a way of accessing God, even though it does kind of say that in the book of Revelation that Jews get into heaven. I cannot say that Muslims have a good way to get to God, even though I've learned a great deal from studying Islam and learning about the way that it reflects upon devotion to God. But what I do know is, I know that my way has connected me to something transcendent, something beyond that numinous God quality. And so I'll preach about what I know and what I can, but I can't preach against what someone else says that they proclaim, because perhaps God speaks to them in different ways. I've also come to realize, the more that I've lived, the way that people express their distinctive faith traditions often has far more to do with differences in culture than it does to do with differences in what God said. Because if you look at much of the ethos of all of these faith traditions that we've been talking about, they pretty much say the same thing. You're supposed to love God. You're supposed to love your neighbor. You're supposed to do justice in the midst of the world. They pretty much say the same things. So perhaps we're seeing the same God reflected through three different lenses, and assuming that our lenses are the perfect lenses through which to see God, when in essence, all of the lenses are somewhat cracked, somewhat twisted. None of them are perfect because we're human beings and not perfect, but they do reflect the perfect God in some way. I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to share this verse right here, and then there's another one. This is Quran 569. That's very similar, and I find a lot of reassurance personally when I read these verses, in the sense that, exactly what Dr. Sadler said, like, who am I, to say who gets into heaven? It's and the criteria according to the Quran, and you'll find Muslims who will say, oh, that's referring to the earliest Jews or the earliest Christians or whatnot. But that's not what the Quran is saying. I mean, according to the Quran, which Muslims believe is divine discourse, it really says the two criteria are to believe in God. This idea of believing in God in the last day, that representing accountability, this idea that you believe you're going to be accountable. And then the second piece is good deeds, is good acts. So that, and for Muslims, faith is never enough. Deeds is very much a part of the salvation question. You have to have faith, but also, show up, right? And walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So yeah.
Thank you.
And as Jews, we believe that all those who are righteous will make it to heaven. I think we actually are probably more on the defensive as Jews rather than focusing on what we believe. We have to spend a lot of time countering the culture that might tell our kids that if they don't believe in Jesus, they're not going to get to heaven. So, but we believe that it's, ethical acts that will get people up to heaven. There are 7 questions, in the Talmud you can go through and see 7 questions you'll be asked when you get up to the gates, if there are such a thing. And the first one is, were you honest in business? Right? Did you appreciate the earthly pleasures? There are so many ways in which our lives are measured, which all our lives are measured.
Beautiful. Thank you. I want to be conscientious of time and recognize that the conversation probably could go on forever. And at the same time, we also know that there's a limitation to online presence and everything, right? Because we're all zoomed out after 2 years. So first off, thank you. Thank you to Rabbi Schindler, to Dr. Mubarak, to Dr. Sadler, and also to Reverend Vladim Plaskin and our Mekmin partnership. Thank you. Secondly, in Judaism, we have a saying, Hashanah Haba'ah, we say at Passover, Hashanah Haba'ah, that next year in person with cookies, right? Like that's the intention, that is the goal. Next year in person with cookies. Information about this came out late because we were hoping, and then deciding to, I guess, the word of 2021 pivot. So thank you to our staff, to Natalie and to Tracy, to everyone to help us who made this happen, to the committee, the Comparative Religion Committee. There is a few years ago, there was a Super Bowl commercial that was made by Toyota, where a minister, got out in his car, in his truck, and then picked up the rabbi along the way, and then they went and picked up the imam, and then they met a Buddhist monk, and then they met some nuns at the football stadium, and they were all cheering for the same football team, right? And at this, and sort of just reminding me, as everything said, is that you can have, you might have your own team, but at the same time, we're also all part of cheering on a greater game, right? We're all part of it, of cheering on something even above us and beyond us. And it was not encouraging to go out and buy Toyota, though my brother, who is the director of advertising, would totally love you to do that. Not trying to encourage that. But it just reminds me that we all can cheer for one another and for something greater than ourselves too. Next week, we're going to be hearing from speakers who represent the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're going to be learning from a scholar, a teacher from the Baha'i tradition. In the following week, we're going to be going to the Ganges region and looking at Buddhism and Hindu and Sikh traditions. And our intention is the last week is to have a speaker who is the speakers who are focused on First Nation in the United States, and helping us to understand native traditions as they have developed in the United States as well. Thank you for being part of this public square. We need this more than ever. We thank Mekmin, and thank you for coming and participating this evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. It was great.
It
Even
was
without
fun. Love working with you all.